Hello, everyone, and welcome to our session today, Micromessaging to Reach and Teach Every Student. Before we begin, I want to cover some housekeeping items. This session will be recorded. Please leave your cameras off and microphones muted throughout the session. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A feature. We will get to as many of them as we can at the end of the session. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our presenter, Nakeia Alsup. Nakeia currently serves as the Assistant Director of Programs at the National Alliance for Partnerships and Equity. She attended the University of Rochester and majored in political science and women's studies and holds a Master of Social Work degree from the University of Maryland, Baltimore School of Social Work. She has over 20 years of experience helping people achieve their goals, along with addressing structural changes and inequities and supporting community empowerment. Nakeia has spent the last 10 years in public education, focusing on dismantling barriers to student and family success, along with the fostering of authentic student and family voice. In addition to her direct service work, she provided leadership on both department and district level efforts around diversity, equity, and inclusion. Nakeia grounds her work in the Angela Y. Davis's quote, "I am no longer accepting the things I cannot change. I am changing the things I cannot accept." She is a licensed clinical social worker of North Carolina and a member of two professional organizations, the National Association of Social Workers of North Carolina chapter and the National Association of Black Social Workers. Within the NASWNC, she serves on the Equity and Inclusion Committee and is responsible for co-leadership of the membership subcommittee. Thank you so much, Nakeia.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. And I am going to share my screen. Awesome. Hopefully you all can see my screen. Thank you all so much for joining me today. I am so excited to be here. So excited to be joining you this afternoon to share the critical work that NAPE is doing with educators all across the country. As educators, your support for students, you do it in countless ways every day and make an impact on their lives, both presently and well into the future. I want to honor and just recognize the dedication that you all showed today by joining me and joining the full conference and joining me today just to learn more about what micromessages are. As Jennifer mentioned, I am a former educator. I joined NAPE earlier this year. Immediately prior to joining NAPE, I worked as a school social worker. So I'm a social worker by profession. I want to share just that my approach to equity work and my work at NAPE is through that social work lens. And my passion for this work is just driven by all of my lived experiences and all of my identities. So our goal for today is to talk about micromessages. How do we achieve our goal of providing for every student and making sure that they have all of the support and the resources they need to thrive, and how we use micromessages to do so. So micromessaging is NAPE's foundational curricula. It leads participants through a process of reflection, examination, and action planning. And what we'll be doing today is just a brief introduction to that curricula. So just some information about NAPE, or the National Alliance for Partnerships and Equity. We are the nation's leading professional alliance committed to building the capacity of educators to increase student access, educational equity, and workforce diversity. We're a consortium of both state and local education agencies, colleges and universities, corporations and businesses. We address educational equity through four main areas of focus. So professional development, similar to what we're doing today. We also work in research and evaluation. We provide technical assistance. And we also work in the advocacy and public policy realm. And we've been doing this work for over 20 years now. So NAPE grounds our professional development work in Glenn Singleton's work, which comes from the book Courageous Conversations. We want you to walk away from our conversation today and the conference in general with just a knowledge and being fully equipped to just work and continue to work in this equity field. So we respectfully ask for you to do 4 things. The first is to stay engaged, whatever that means for you. Taking care of yourself. If you have a need to take a brief break, I have my water next to me. So whatever you need to do to remain engaged and stay present in the moment in this community with others, we definitely respect that you will do that. We also ask that you expect to experience some discomfort. This work is challenging, as you've heard from each session today, and as you know from your own work, this work is hard. It comes with some discomfort. It's very personal. So we just ask that you sit with those feelings and just expect to have some feelings of discomfort. We also ask that you speak your truth. We will have some opportunities to reflect and interact during our short time together today. And we just ask that you speak what makes the most sense for you, what speaks to your own lived experiences. We understand that there isn't one truth, that there are many truths just based on our own lenses and our own lived experiences. And then along with that, we ask that you put on a listening ear. Listen as if you're wrong. There are areas that we can all do better with as far as our journey. So we ask that you also listen as if you might be wrong. We like to use that phrase. And then last, along those lines, expect and accept a lack of closure. We view this work as a journey that is ever evolving, ongoing. It's not a destination, but we aim to start where everyone is and then keep that work moving forward. I first like to start off our conversation with some just thoughts on equity versus equality. I know this is something that has come up both in the keynote, and I'm sure it's come up in other sessions as well. So looking at those 2 images that I have on the screen, making sure that we're all aware that they aren't interchangeable. Equity and equality are not the same. So as you'll see in the first picture, all of the students, and these are students in a classroom, all of the students are getting the same treatment. There's a whiteboard on the wall with the term equity, equality in the on the whiteboard. It's very high on the wall. Each of the students is provided with a green stool so they can reach it. They all have the same opportunity to work on the whiteboard. Conversely, in picture 2, you'll see that they all have what they need to actually engage in the work. So you'll see that the tallest student doesn't need a stool at all. He's able or she's able or they're able to reach the whiteboard and be able to interact with the lesson that the teacher is teaching, and whatever work that they need to do on the board, they're able to reach the board and do the work without the need for a stool. But the second 2 students, one is a little taller than the other, so one needs 2 stools in order to be able to access the whiteboard, and one only needs 1. And then lastly, we have a student on the end that's in a wheelchair, and instead of being provided with a stool, unlike the equality photo or image, that student has a laptop to be able to engage in the work. So this just shows just the differences between equity and equality. So equality focuses on the group, it focuses on quantity, and then it focuses on sameness, whereby equity focuses on fairness, just giving every student what they need, making sure that it's quality in terms of support, and then just, again, making sure that the needs of each person and each individual are met. So we'll now jump into NAPE's definition of educational equity to help frame our conversation today. Educational equity is realized when students have the support and resource that they need to thrive in school. So similar to how we saw that equity image in the last slide, that they have everything that they need academically, they have everything that they need socially and emotionally. It requires that educators and administrators recognize the larger systemic ways students are discriminated against in a number of different ways. It could be race, it could be gender, ethnicity, ability status, gender identity, sexuality, and other many dimensions. But with this recognition, educators and administrators enact policies, curriculum, the strategies they use for instruction, all seek to mitigate those inequities. So achieving educational equity means that we don't see any trends, no trends across demographics, no trends across social cultural variables. when looking at both classroom and school data, and then looking at district data in general. What does this look like? It just means and looks like that every student is successful. We have authentic relationships amongst students, with staff, with families, that there's a real connection there that's happening. That correct curriculum and instruction is adaptive and responsive to student needs, that each student is getting the resources and supports that they need, the expectations are high, and that the school itself, the school environment, is a place that's welcoming and safe and inviting for each student. So where do we stand as educators on this journey? We like to use this graphic just to illustrate this process. Educators who seek to move toward educational equity interrogate their own perceptions and actions and how those hinder the well-being of students. We focus on the locus of control. So your own locus or our own locus of control. What do I have within my sphere of control, taking from Stephen Covey. For classroom teachers or faculty, it's your classroom, it's your interaction with students. For administrators, it's that as well, in addition to policies and procedures. So we want to make sure that we know that we have such an important role in the life of our students. It's what got us into education to begin with, and with our work with students, it's what's got me into education to become a school social worker. So we want you to be encouraged to focus on your sphere of influence and what's within your control, which again are micro messages that we'll talk a little bit more about. So why micro messages? Why focus on communication and not simply on academics itself? So as a school social worker, I definitely understood the frustration of educators wanting to go in and teach, but having to deal with all of these outside forces, things that weren't within our control. And I was often brought in for many of those, whether it was a family dealing with a eviction notice or food insecurity or a need for clothing or other items, helping teacher support in that way. But I often heard that frustration of, I just want to teach. And I want you all to know that we can be mindful of what we control, what's within our sphere of control. We can control our communication, we can control our classroom environment, we can control our interaction with students. And we can become more mindful about micro messages, those messages that we send to students, both unconsciously and consciously. They can be implicit or explicit, those social stereotypes that we form outside of our own consciousness. It's something that we all have the capacity to do, and we'll delve more deeply into that. This is the NAPE culture wheel. It's our roadmap to how we do our work and how we see our work with educators. So it's a cycle. You'll see as I click through each of the spots on the wheel, that it starts with cultural stereotypes, and cultural stereotypes influence and add to bias, which then comes out in our micro messaging. And then it leads to either advantages or disadvantages for students that accumulate over time, that affect a student's self-efficacy, their belief in themselves, their belief that they can actually achieve their goals, and then ultimately affects their behavior. And educators do have a point of interruption in this cycle. So that's what we're going to focus on today. I want to start with looking at some images that are cultural stereotypes. So I am going to go through each of the images, and then I'm going to put in a chat. So this is going to be an interactive part of our session today. I'm going to add that to the chat. I would like each of you to go into a Jamboard. And as I go through each of the images, I want you to look at the images and tell me what cultural stereotypes you see on the screen. So that I have 3 slides with 3 sets of images. So if everyone can click on the Jamboard, and hopefully you have access to that via that chat. I see a hand being raised. Oh, Yes, yes, yes. Okay, so what we'll do is we'll use the Q&A. If you can use the Q&A feature as I go through each of the images and just jot down there what you see in terms of cultural stereotypes. And everyone should have access to the Q&A. I'm sorry about that. As we go through each, I want you to ask yourself, what are the stereotypes you recognize and attribute to the image? What do you think is the history of that particular stereotype? Where did it come from? How are the stereotypes used? So here is the first set of images. Is that clear to everyone what we're doing? We're utilizing the Q&A and just jotting there what you see in terms of the cultural stereotypes in each of those images. So here's the first one. So these are actual t-shirts. So I would love to hear folks' thoughts about what cultural stereotypes do you see in these t-shirts? I see women can't do math, yes. An intelligent woman, yes. Yeah, so that's pretty much the consensus. Women can't do math, women aren't academic, yes. Women are shallow or materialistic. We have blondes. That's also another cultural stereotype. If you're pretty, you don't have to be smart. Yes, girls are not as smart as boys. Women are not intelligent. Yes, 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 yes. Women need to ask for help. Lack of focus on academics. So yeah, what kind of message is this sending to girls when they see these kind of t-shirts? When they wear them themselves, women can't have both beauty and brains, definitely. Thank you all for sharing. So here's the next set. Or this is a single image. What about this one? What cultural stereotypes are in this image? Women can't use technology. Yes. We have someone that works at a osteopathic school. Yes. Individuals in the medical profession don't have the knowledge needed in the fields. Healthcare professionals are incompetent. Women are not advanced thinkers. Yes. Women don't understand big words. Again, think about the messages that this is sending when you see this, when folks see this, when students see this. Women can't read, osteopathic doctors aren't too smart, pink is for women. Yes, all of these cultural stereotypes come just from this one image. And this is from a company that makes high-priced fashionable scrubs. They came under fire for this ad, which was subsequently removed. I'm going to go to the next image, which is pretty recent. At least they're all pretty recent within the last couple of years. So here's the next one from H&M. What cultural stereotypes do you see here? We have folks with very strong reactions, hating this image. Yes, there was a lot of backlash related to this when this came out a few years ago. Only Caucasians can survive tough situations. African Americans look like monkeys. Yes. White child is a survival expert, but the Black child is a monkey. Perpetuates the stereotype of Black people being equated to monkeys. One boy is smart, the other is cool. Yes, all of these. So again, thinking about messages, what is this sending to children, to students, to individuals in general? It's bringing up very strong responses from all of us. So a day later issued an apology, H&M, and removed the image of the young African-American boy from their website after this backlash. Thank you all for participating in that. So again, when we think about messages that are sent, either consciously or unconsciously, they're being communicated all the time. The images we see, we can go into a grocery store, we can look on social media, we're constantly being fed messages, and those messages are communicating something to us. So we need to consider the difference between impact and intent. So there could be no ill intent behind any of these images. When we think back to that first slide, oh, it's just a t-shirt. Oh, yeah, math is hard for girls. Not a big deal, but it actually is a huge deal. It's a huge deal. It has such a huge impact on the message, the psyche of those that see that message. There are a lot of girls that have internalized a lot of what's on that was on that first slide with the t-shirts, that girls can't do math, that math is hard, and have ultimately turned a lot of girls away from math and that field in general. So it has long-term sustaining consequences. So although the intent might not be a bad intent or with any malice behind it, but the impact is definitely hard. So thinking through all of that when we think about the messages that each of us send individually. So next I'm going to show you a video, and I am very hopeful that this works. I practiced this a few times to make sure that you can hear the video. This is a video about how we counteract those cultural stereotypes and the messages that we are receiving. Because again, they're out there, they're everywhere. We're getting messages constantly, but how do we counteract those? So I have a video that I would like to share with all of you, which is a TED Talk by a novelist named Chimamanda Adichie. In it, she tells the story of how she found her authentic cultural voice, and she guides us on how to be more mindful about how we view others, especially those that are not like us. I would like to note that before we view the video, Adichie has expressed some views about transgender women that don't reflect the powerful message of this TED Talk or our views at NAPE. It just reminds me that we are on a lifelong journey, as I mentioned earlier, in search of behaviors, attitudes, and opinions that invite others into our equity conversation, not to devalue or label someone's experiences as less than. So I just wanted to share that before I play this video. Please let me know if you can't hear. Okay, give me 1 second. Let's try that again. I was afraid this would happen. Give me 1 second, folks. All right, let's try that again.
I'm a storyteller, and I would like to tell you a few personal stories about what I like to call the danger of the single story. I grew up on a university campus in eastern Nigeria. My mother says that I started reading at the age of 2, although I think 4 is probably close to the truth. So I was an early reader, and what I read were British and American children's books. I was also an early writer. And when I began to write at about the age of 7, stories in pencil with crayon illustrations that my poor mother was obligated to read, I wrote exactly the kinds of stories I was reading. All my characters were white and blue-eyed. They played in the snow. They ate apples. And they talked a lot about the weather, how lovely it was that the sun had come out. Now, this despite the fact that I lived in Nigeria. I had never been outside Nigeria. We didn't have snow. We ate mangoes. And we never talked about the weather because there was no need to. My characters also drank a lot of ginger beer because the characters in the British books I read drank ginger beer. Never mind that I had no idea what ginger beer was. And for many years afterwards, I would have a desperate desire to taste ginger beer. But that is another story. What this demonstrates, I think, is how impressionable and vulnerable we are in the face of a story, particularly as children. Because all I had read were books in which characters were foreign, I had become convinced that books, by their very nature, had to have foreigners in them and had to be about things with which I could not personally identify. Now, things changed when I discovered African books. There weren't many of them available, and they weren't quite as easy to find as the foreign books, but because of writers like Chinua Achebe and Kamaralaye, I went through a mental shift in my perception of literature. I realized that people like me, girls with skin the color of chocolate, whose kinky hair could not form ponytails, could also exist in literature. I started to write about things I recognized. Now, I loved those American and British books I read. They stirred my imagination. They opened up new worlds for me. But the unintended consequence was that I did not know that people like me could exist in literature. So what the discovery of African writers did for me was this. It saved me from having a single story of what books are. I come from a conventional middle-class Nigerian family. My father was a professor. My mother was an administrator. And so we had, as was the norm, live-in domestic help who would often come from nearby rural villages. So the year I turned 8, we got a new houseboy. His name was Fide. The only thing my mother told us about him was that his family was very poor. My mother sent yams and rice and our old clothes to his family. And when I didn't finish my dinner, my mother would say, "Finish your food. Don't you know people like Fide's family have nothing?" So I felt enormous pity for Fide's family. Then one Saturday, we went to his village to visit. And his mother showed us a beautifully patterned basket made of dyed raffia that his brother had made. I was startled. It had not occurred to me that anybody in his family could actually make something. All I had heard about them was how poor they were, so that it had become impossible for me to see them as anything else but poor. Their poverty was my single story of them. Years later, I thought about this when I left Nigeria to go to university in the United States. I was 19. My American roommate was shocked by me. She asked where I had learned to speak English so well and was confused when I said that Nigeria happened to have English as its official language. She asked if she could listen to what she called my tribal music and was consequently very disappointed when I produced my tape of Mariah Carey. She assumed that I did not know how to use a stove. What struck me was this: she had felt sorry for me even before she saw me. Her default position toward me, as an African, was a kind of patronizing, well-meaning pity. My roommate had a single story of Africa, a single story of catastrophe. In this single story, there was no possibility of Africans being similar to her in any way, no possibility of feelings more complex than pity, no possibility of a connection as human equals. I must say that before I went to the US, I didn't consciously identify as African. But in the US, whenever Africa came up, people turned to me, never mind that I knew nothing about places like Namibia. But I did come to embrace this new identity, and in many ways, I think of myself now as African, although I still get quite irritable when Africa is referred to as a country, the most recent example being my otherwise wonderful.
We're actually going to stop the video right there. It's actually closer to 20 minutes long. We don't have time to view the full video today. I can definitely share it with all of you. It's an amazing, amazing video. But Niche just highlights just the dangers of a single story, the dangers of those cultural stereotypes. Those stereotypes just create, like I said, a single story. And the problem with those single stories is not that they're untrue, it's that they're incomplete. They make one story the whole story. And just the dangers of doing that, especially when it comes to our role as educators and how we see our students, just being mindful that we don't see them as a single story, that they are multidimensional, and that we provide that space to see them in their whole humanness. What single stories do we hold for our students? What happens as a result? So I just want you to think a few minutes about that in terms of your own work, what you've seen in your institutions, what single stories have come up related to students that you may work with, and then what happens as a result. If those of you feel comfortable sharing, definitely, if you feel comfortable sharing, include it in the Q&A. What single stories have you seen that have come up about students and what happens as a result? I'll give folks a few more minutes. Definitely no pressure to share, but just something to be thinking about as we go about our day-to-day work as educators interacting with students. Oh, I see that a few have come in. We generalize all 470 medical students is not coming to class prepared. They don't study hard enough. They're entitled, and many others. Someone else listed African-American males should be handled with care because there aren't that many in the program. Yeah, single stories. Thank you both for sharing. So as we've discussed, cultural stereotypes and the dangers of those stereotypes and those single stories, I now want to delve more deeply into the next section of the NAPE cultural wheel, which is bias. Biases are the result of those cultural stereotypes. So that girls aren't good at math, or any of the cultural stereotypes or messages that we receive. Those biases, as I mentioned earlier, can be explicit or implicit. For the most part, explicit biases are illegal today, thanks in part to legislation like Title IX. But conversely, implicit biases are those unconscious decisions that we make about others that occur very quickly. They influence our decisions, they influence our behaviors in ways that we might not be able to readily identify. One important area where implicit biases show up is through the micromessages that we communicated, as we've been talking about. So let's talk a little bit about unconscious or implicit biases. So those are those social stereotypes that we form outside of our consciousness. Those biases stem from our brain's tendency to organize information by setting up filters to organize and categorize what we observe in our environments, to help make sense of those situations. And ultimately, they're helpful for our survival, for us making sense of the world. All of us have probably heard the popular phrase, if it walks like a duck, quacks like a duck, it's probably a duck. So your brain's filter tells you it's a duck. But sometimes those filters can present barriers to equitable treatment, both in the classroom and how we interact and impact our students and the assumptions that we make about them. So here we see the effects of those biases, how they influence the decisions we make, how they get organized, the information gets filtered, and ultimately influence our evaluations of people and students, and ultimately the value that they have. So it's very important that we become more aware of our biases. So I want you to think a little bit about how biases show up in your school, in your policies and procedures. We won't spend a lot of time here, but something for you to think about in terms of what policies and procedures exist in your institution, and how bias might show up there. So after today's session, definitely would encourage you to spend some time thinking and reflecting on that in terms of where you see bias showing up in your school, and specifically your policies and procedures. I've included some resources here to invite you to continue the exploration, continue the reflection and the learning. You've definitely taken a step here and you're on your journey of equity work. But I encourage you all to delve more deeply into your own personal bias. I believe this was mentioned in the keynote address earlier. There are a number of implicit association tests that are available. We have them linked on our NAPE website, and you'll see the link on the screen there. You can go directly to the NAPE website and have access to those to be able to take the implicit association test and see where your biases lie, and we all have them. I want you to spend some time just reflecting on the results if you do take it. Are you surprised? Are you not surprised? Why or why not? And then lastly, there are a number of resources, both on YouTube. There's a great book called The Blind Spot, Hidden Biases of Good People, that is available. So again, I encourage you to continue with your exploration, your learning, and your reflection in terms of your own personal biases that will help with how you communicate with others in the micro messages that you send. So next, and for the rest of our time together, we'll dive more deeply into those micro messages, the biases that shape our communication that leads to those micro messages. So micro messages, as we've talked a little bit about today, are those small unconscious messages that we communicate to others, both in a negative way and a positive way. So those micro messages can be positive. They're often unconscious, and they're communicated sometimes without even saying a word. There are a number of ways that we communicate, as we'll spend a little more time in the next slide. I'm just talking through the ways that we communicate. So on one side, we have those micro inequities on the right side, which are those negative messages. Those messages that make folks feel excluded, devalued, discouraged. For example, I want you to think back to when you were a student, or if you're currently a student now, think back to being in a classroom, interacting with your peers and your teacher. And pretend that you're sitting there, your teacher is teaching a lesson, and you constantly have your hand raised. Your teacher is asking a question, expecting some engagement from you and your classmates. You're continuing to raise your hand. And the teacher or professor sees you, but they intentionally do not call on you. I want you to think about, how does that make you feel? And for some of us, that situation has actually happened. How did it make you feel? And ultimately, after that happens multiple times, so that accumulation of disadvantage, those accumulation of negative messages, how likely are you to continue raising your hand? More than likely, if that continues to happen over time, you continue to raise your hand, your teacher or professor or instructor intentionally does not call on you or unintentionally doesn't call on you, you're more likely to not raise your hand as time goes on. And then on the flip side, we have micro affirmations. So as I've stated, micro messages can be positive, and they can be used to reach and teach every student. Those are those messages that make us feel valued. They make us feel encouraged and included. And again, I want you to pretend that you're back in school, and your teacher or professor says to you while you're sitting there working hard on a problem, "I really appreciate how sincerely you're working on this, that you're trying on this. How about you divide it into smaller chunks? Have you tried that before?" Now, with that message, how would that make you feel? Are you more likely to persist and perhaps actually solve the problem if you receive that kind of comment from your teacher or instructor? So again, just thinking about the differences between the micro inequities, which are the negative messages, and the micro affirmations, which are positive. So we want to lean on the side of micro affirmations. We want most, if not all, of our messages that we send to our students to be those micro affirmations, those messages that make them feel valued, that make them feel included, and make them feel encouraged. As I mentioned, communication happens in a number of different ways. It's not necessarily all verbal. We communicate all the time. So in the two examples I gave you, the second for the micro affirmations, that was a verbal communication and praise that student received from that particular teacher. Micro messages can also be how things are said. So we talked about what's said, but how things are said. So we can say the same exact statement in two different ways. So the difference of inflection can have very real differences in the meaning that's communicated. We have nonverbal, which are body language. So sometimes lack of eye contact, if you're trying to make eye contact with the student or a student is trying to make eye contact with the teacher, that lack thereof can definitely send a message that the student infers. Or maybe it's an eye roll or a snort or a yawn. If you're speaking and you see somebody yawning, that sends a message that can be perceived negatively by the person receiving it. We also have those contextual messages. So what's present or what's not present, thinking about culture, thinking about artifacts. As a school social worker in my work, that was one thing I was really passionate about, is just making sure that our school environment was reflective of student culture, that our students saw themselves in our building, that it was a welcoming place. But for some students, if they don't see themselves reflected in that school environment or school culture, was sending a message to them contextually. If that's a negative or a positive, it can be either, depending on what is there or what's not there. We also have omission. So this is what is not said or not done. So just imagine that you're in a group of 3 people. There's a colleague or a person that comes up to you and invites your 2 colleagues to lunch. They smile at you in a very friendly manner, but they make it clear to you that you're not invited to lunch. How does that make you feel as that third person, the person that didn't get the invitation? And then what about the other 2 that were invited? It happens all the time, and it has such a huge impact on a sense of inclusion. And thinking about it, it happens all the time. I saw it happen with students all the time in my role as a school social worker, with how students interacted with each other and how devalued and excluded students felt if they weren't included in those kind of social interactions. And then lastly, we have praise and criticism, which is pretty self-explanatory, can be negative or positive related to praise and criticism. So all of these matter greatly when we interact with students in a classroom. They feel, they see, they experience every message that we send, both intentionally or unintentionally. That's the great thing, we can have a positive impact on this cycle of messages. Despite cultural stereotypes, despite bias, we can impact. There is an educator point of interruption in this cycle. Just thinking about
I'm so
I'm
sorry,
sorry.
Nakeia. If I can ask just a quick question pertaining to this slide from our question and answer section. One of our attendees asked, are all of these considered microaggressions? I know you talked about they can be positive or negative depending on what the content is, but
Yes.
just wanted to ask that question before we moved on.
Yes, yes. And I know we only have a few minutes left, but no, they are not all considered microaggressions. Again, messages that we send can be positive or negative. And the focus is making sure that most or all of our interactions, our micro messages are positive. So they're encouraging, that they include students and making students feel valued as opposed to what's on the opposite end. So in our final few minutes left together before we wrap up, I just want to show you our full NAPE culture wheel. In our full workshop that we provide for micromessaging to reach and teach every student, we delve more deeply into the accumulation of advantages or disadvantages. So as I mentioned a little bit earlier, if that cycle of negative messages continues, how those accumulate over time, or even the converse, if those accumulations of positive messages accumulate over time, how that affects student self-efficacy and behavior. I have included a QR code at the top of the screen. If you all are interested in learning more about NAPE and our PD offerings, feel free to use the QR code or visit our website at napeequity.org and learn more about what we're doing with educators across the country. So in our final few moments, I just want to say thank you all for taking the time with me today. Like I said, I'm a former educator and have such a profound respect for the work that all of you do each and every day, especially over the last few years that have been especially hard. I just want to continue I want to support you all to continue on your journey with supporting each and every student, having those micro messages to reach and teach all students, with helping them be the best that they can be by supporting all of their individual needs. And I want to leave you with these words from author Jimmy Cassis: every student, every day, whatever it takes. So when you think about your micro messaging, think about that: every student, every day, whatever it takes. So thank you all for joining me today. I know we only have a couple minutes left, but I am available to answer any last questions that we have before we close.
Thank you so much, Nakeia. I don't see any other questions in our question and answer section. I do see a comment from part of our conversation a little bit ago where we were talking about a single story instance, and one of our attendees said that sometimes we assume students are not participating because they don't know the answer or want to participate. Great example of an assumption there.
Yes, definitely. Well, again, thank you all for joining today, and definitely, like I said, continue on your journey of this very important equity work. Thank you.
And I want to thank you all as well for attending. And Nakeia, thank you for teaching us today. Thank you all as well for participating in the micromessaging to reach and teach every student session. And please, everyone, enjoy the remainder of your conference. We have one more session this afternoon. Thank you so much.